Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of Congregational Humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. I'm David Breeden, Senior Minister. Welcome. The philosopher Theodor Adorno wrote this: "The need to let suffering speak is a condition of all truth. For suffering is objectivity that weighs upon the subject." The need to let suffering speak is a condition of all truth. For suffering is objectivity that weighs upon the subject. Now, Adorno was one of the creators of what's known nowadays as critical theory. In the American culture wars, we hear a lot about critical race theory, which is one of the many variations of Adorno's method. These two sentences encapsulate the why of critical theory. As Adorno says, suffering is objective. It can be measured by listening to the people who are suffering. Adorno states the matter bluntly: the need to let suffering speak is a condition of all truth. In critical race theory, that's about listening to people who suffer from the effects of racism. In other words, old white guys like me have no business pontificating, white-splaining about the suffering. My obligation is to listen. That's why last night, right here in this room, we had a beautiful night of black poetry and music. The white folks listened, and we heard about suffering, overcoming, resilience, and love. Shutting up, sitting down, and listening does not sit well with the pontificators of white supremacy. And there are other sorts of critical theory. Critical theory is called for anytime those who rule over us, be that a mayor, city council, police, president, Congress, Supreme Court, act without listening to the voices of the people who they hurt. As I've related before, my mother was illiterate, and most of her life she worked as what she called a washerwoman, cleaning floors, doing laundry, and trying to make a living. As those of you who don't know, I am an Ozark hillbilly. I no longer speak my native dialect, but I hear my mother's words when she often said, "Why don't them government people listen to us poor folks about what we need? They is so many of us after all." To which I would only respond, everyone in power thinks they know what poor folks need, so they're not going to ask you. My mother knew intuitively what Adorno philosophized about. The need to let suffering speak is a condition of truth. Now, she's long dead and her struggles to survive are done, yet still Adorno's words challenge us. When will we listen? White supremacy cannot allow suffering to speak. That's what we see in the American culture wars. Patriarchy cannot allow suffering to speak. Greed cannot allow suffering to speak. And as I've mentioned before, Adorno's most famous student is Angela Davis, who, after studying with Adorno in California as a grad student, went out to find ways to let suffering speak. And she's still at it today. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that no one, politically left, right, or center, likes the State of the Union just now. Yet, as I've said a lot of times from this pulpit, when we look at American history with anything more than a cursory glance, we begin to see U.S. history as a long struggle back and forth. Progress is not and never has been forward or a cakewalk. The challenge is that human life is short and the struggle for freedom is long. And unfortunately, many of the people who have struggled most did not live to see their own victories. But many Americans sense that something has changed today. Reflect on this. In 1958, polling showed that 77% of Americans said they trusted their government. 77%. During the lowest point in the Trump presidency, 17% of Americans trusted their government. 17%. Well, we've rebounded. In this month, June, Pew Research found that trust has gone up to 21%. Fewer than 1 in 4 Americans trust our government to do what is in the best interest of the people. That isn't real good. Democracy can't work that way. Former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, in a case called Casey versus Planned Parenthood of Southern Pennsylvania, it's a case that we've been hearing about quite a bit recently, wrote this: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." Break that down just a bit. The right to define one's own concept of existence, meaning, the universe, and the mystery of human life. Now that all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But as the old saying goes, the proof is in the pudding. Europeans battled for centuries over the question of whether or not individuals even had rights, because under monarchy, people were subjects, not citizens. Subjected. At least that's how the rebels in this hemisphere saw the monarchies. Here in the U.S., to the contrary, we have battled for centuries about what the limits are that can be imposed upon individual rights. At the moment, individual rights are winning against collective responsibility. I suspect that's not the way toward increasing trust in government, although the direction we're headed at the moment has been the goal of radical conservatives from the very beginning of the Republic. It was no secret ever. Read the Federalist Papers. The tension has always been there. Individual or collective, or what's the compromise? Member of Congress and presidential candidate Barbara Jordan said, quote, "A nation is formed by the willingness of each of us to share in the responsibility for upholding the common good," end quote. Barbara Jordan, the trailblazer of black women in government, knew something about suffering and about freedom, didn't she? The common good has always been an essential element for political progressives and for we humanists. As I've said many times, my favorite line in the first Humanist Manifesto from 1933 reads, quote, "Humanists demand a shared life in a shared world." The two subsequent manifestos in 73 and 2000 softened this language because many thought that those words were way too radical. But I have never thought so. Though sharing has long been linked in the U.S. to that really dirty word, socialist. John Dietrich and Ray Bragg, the ministers of FUS who signed that manifesto back in 1933, were openly democratic socialists, as were many of the signers of the first manifesto. And yes, we need to remember that the manifesto was published in the spring of 1933 before President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which was kind of democratic socialist. Although Roosevelt, of course, tried to put shade on that fact. But sometime when you got nothing else to do a little web searching on the political views of many of Roosevelt's administration, which, of course, is exactly what the House Un-American Activities Committee would do after the Second World War. John Dietrich was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s, but he was retired from here already, so there wasn't much they could do to him. It's all about the common good, in which all citizens have basic rights, clean water, healthy food, medical care, education, support in old age. At which point, maybe they can reach the point, if you have all those things, to get to Justice Kennedy's idea of freedom, right? Democratic socialism is not about violent revolution. That's always been the point of democratic socialism. Redistribute the wealth through taxes instead of bloody revolution. Democratic means sticking with democracy and letting the citizens vote. After the Second World War, nearly every nation that did not fall under the domination of the Soviet Union began to practice democratic socialism. The U.S. toyed with many of those ideas, but at this point in our history, most New Deal programs are gone. It's not about sharing today. Humanists demand a shared life and a shared world. For many of us, our demand to share has expanded, not contracted, over time. We demand sharing with other living things and with the planet itself. Nowadays, we call that environmental justice. And it's the right thing to do. Share in this world. Sharing life with other living things, sharing life with future generations of human beings and animals. It's all about Barbara Jordan's common good. I know that I am a political idealist. That's why I'm not a politician. I like being a political idealist. But as far as I'm concerned, none of that's about politics. It's about basic ethics. And so thought the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. But back to Justice Anthony Kennedy's list of what he called at the heart of liberty. Defining your own concepts of existence, meaning, the universe, and the mystery of human life. These things sound good, but what does the right to existence even mean? Does it mean the right to nutritious food and water? Oh, apparently not. How many poor people have the time to consider meaning, the nature of the universe, or the mystery of human life? I know my parents didn't. Justice Kennedy graduated, by the way, from Harvard Law School and took over his father's law practice. That's his history, just saying, right? And I hear my mother's words, why don't the government listen to us poor folks about what we need? There's so many of us, after all. Sorry, Mom, the power is not going to listen. History glosses over the time and boredom of social action. Who wants to watch a movie about sitting, as many of us have, for hours and hours waiting for an action to begin? Sitting on the curbs in the street, and we never seem to get things together for that march. Watching social progress is a lot more boring than watching paint dry. The people of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis have been exploring meaning-making and value-making outside of societal norms, what John Dewey, one of the signers of the manifesto, called the familiar furniture of the mind, right? We've been exploring things outside that familiar furniture since the 1870s. This congregation began as the Minnesota chapter of the National Liberal League. Now, this was a group dedicated to the separation of church and state. Specifically, they were fighting the regulation of the U.S. mail to accord with conservative Christian values. We've heard that. Through the Comstock laws, which, for example, declared women's reproductive information pornography and atheism and agnosticism just too dangerous for the delicate minds of women. After losing those battles, they lost all of it. After losing all of those battles from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the Minnesota Liberal League here became a Darwin reading group. and the Darwin Reading Group eventually became a Unitarian congregation. We have an interesting history here. Social progress, we know, is along a road full of potholes. The Minneapolis Pride signs this year give the beginning year of 1972. I'm really glad that has happened before it has been 1973 that was mentioned. Why do I love that change? Because it recognizes the struggle. The Stonewall Rebellion in New York City was in June of 1969. Through the late 1960s and 70s, a group of GLBTQ folks here at FUS met, and they called themselves the Invisibles because they felt like it, and they felt like they had to be the Invisibles. In 1972, that group gathered here and marched across the street over to the park, which I hope I'm going to be doing, and most of you will be doing today, over to the park to commemorate the Stonewall Rebellion. And the group over there, several of them were arrested by Minneapolis police. That was the beginning, a struggle, an arrest. Yes, the first gay pride was a riot in New York City. Here in Minneapolis, our first gay pride was a demonstration that led to arrests. It's important, 1972, because that remembers the real history. It's important to remember how long the struggle is. We so often hear progressives quoting Theodore Parker, one of our favorite Unitarian ministers, and that talk about that moral arc of the universe bending toward justice, which is a great sentiment, but not what Parker actually said. In his 1852 sermon titled Justice and Conscience, Parker said this, quote, "You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right," by which he meant the right of conscience, not the right wing. "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe," he said. "The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of my sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice," end quote. A little more complex than what we remember. Again, it does sound like something that we progressives live in hope of. Sounds good. But of course, when you start to think about it, what is a moral universe? Those of us who trust the scientific method are not likely to think there's anything quite moral out there in the cosmos, aside from our own human moralities. Now, how did Parker divine the morality of the universe? Well, it was by his conscience, his individual conscience. Now, why would human conscience have any ability to divine the morality in the universe? I can divine the morality of human beings. I see it on both sides. But that earthquake that causes the killer tsunami and the black hole that is at the center of our galaxy, what's moral about those? Reverend Theodore Parker devoted his professional life to the abolition of slavery. For his pains, he had to keep a firearm with him at all times. He escaped attack by violent mobs several times. He fought to help escaped Africans, and he acted against the Supreme Court decisions and against federal law. Frustrated by the slowness of change, Parker joined 5 others to fund John Brown's attack at Harper's Ferry. This was an act of treason. We know that John Brown did not end well, but Parker could have been hanged as well. In fear of his life, Parker left the country, and he died in Italy at the age of 50. The year was 1860. A year before the Civil War, 3 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah, the moral universe was bending toward justice in the case of slavery in the U.S. He saw that. The moral universe was also bending toward some immoral things in the future: lynching, white riots, redlining of neighborhoods, Jim Crow. The universe was bending toward the torture and murder of Emmett Till, and a generation later, George Floyd. The universe was bending toward our contemporary Supreme Court. I don't like that bending. I'm not being cynical. I'm saying that I'm agreeing with Barack Obama when he took those words and said, we've got to get our hands on that thing and bend it ourselves. The need to let suffering speak is a condition of all truth, for suffering is objectivity that weighs upon the subject. Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us about what government should look like. Quote, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands in the way of love." Amen, MLK. Today we celebrate a victory for human rights. At Pride, it's time to celebrate. We need that around here. But we also need to remember the suffering that is not being listened to, because, as Adorno says, that's where all justice begins. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.